I'm going to walk you through the supplies needed to follow along in a step-by-step koi tutorial, watercolor koi tutorial. If you want to get these supplies together, I'll just go through them real quick. First thing you need to get is some watercolor paper, and it needs to be a minimum of 140-pound weight watercolor paper. They sell a 90-pound. It's really difficult to work with, so I don't recommend it. If that's all you have and you want to start with that, that's okay. You don't need to run out and buy something new. If you have none and you're going to buy something, choose 140-pound. And it can come in a pad like this that you tear off the pages. So then what you'll do is you'll tear off one of the pages. And then the other supplies you're going to need is some drafting tape or painter's tape, and it has less tacky, less glue, so it won't ruin your paper when you peel it off. If you can't find that, again, if you're short on supplies and you just want to start with what you have, you can use masking tape, but what you will do is before you use it, when you tear it off, you will put it on your clothes. Even if you're using painter's tape, I like to do this. Put it on your clothes so that it gets some lint on it and it takes away some of the stickiness. Then when you put it on your paper, it won't peel up as much. Then you'll need a pencil and eraser. If you have an artist drawing pencil, a B or HB is recommended, and a kneaded eraser. They come in a little plastic wrapped, looks like just a square, and it's a kneaded eraser because you can knead it like this. Again, if you're buying new supplies, go ahead and get this kind. If you're working with what you already have, you can use a mechanical pencil. I like these number 2 mechanical pencil because it has very fine tip. If you're sharpening one, it might get a little fat on you. And just make sure that if it has an eraser, you use only a white eraser, no yellow erasers like a regular school pencil. That yellow can mess up your paper. This may or may not work. You're going to try not to do a lot of erasing anyway, but or a plain white eraser like this. And then you need some sort of board that can handle getting wet. So I actually like a clipboard that doesn't have a big bulky handle. This is a nice size. The paper, this is a 9x12 paper. You could use something smaller than that to start if you want, although I recommend, if you can, use a 9x12 paper, and then we're going to make a border and make it an 8x10. If you go too small, then you get really fussy. The next part I'm going to describe in terms of supplies are the paints. When I first started, I bought one of these travel kits. I call it my Polly Pocket of paints. I just love it. It's designed for plein air painting, for taking outdoors. But it's a nice compact way to get started if you don't have a set. And if whatever you have, just start with that again. And if you like it and you want to invest more in doing it later, you can get new supplies. But this one, you open it up like this, and it just has these little pans that are already filled with the paint, the watercolor paint that is dry, and you have to reconstitute it a little. This one comes with really cute. I'll do another post about how to use this for outdoors, but it's a really cute thing. So there's this. And then this is the one I showed how to fill. This is my palette, which I've talked about before. And it's actually designed to travel also, but it came empty. And then I filled it with my own tubes of paint. And I labeled it in the beginning, but the labels keep coming off, so I just by memory most of the time. Usually I remember what color I had in there, and then I refill it periodically. And then you'll also need a squirt bottle of some sort. This is just a normal household cleaner squirt bottle, that's not been used for cleaner, it's just water. You can use one like this, or they sell small misting bottles, which I really like because the mist is a little finer, and of course it's small and it works for at-home or plein air painting. And then Of course, some water containers. I like to have 2 water containers, one large for rinsing the dirty brushes off, and one small for clean water. You could have them both the same size, large or medium or whatever, but it just helps me remember the small one is my clean water, so I'm not likely to rinse off my brush in a small container. It helps me remember which one is clean and which one's dirty. And then on the brushes, I like, again, use what you have. But if you're going to go out and buy some, it's nice to have one relatively large flat brush. This is a Cotman by Winsor & Newton, and it's a 1-inch. The bristles, the brush head is 1 inch. It's a nice size. You probably don't need bigger than that to get started. And then I have several rounds. This one's from Hobby Lobby, and it is a 16, number 16, and it's a round, and this was a Master's Touch brand. And what's nice about this is it's kind of thick enough to hold a decent amount of water and paint, but it comes to a nice point, so that's good. And then this is a 10, and you'll see that even though it is a smaller brush, it doesn't come to as fine a point. And there are actually situations where you don't need or want that fine point. This is good for details and cutting in close to subjects. This is good for, it's not really a mop, but it kind of acts more like a mop, and where you're just blopping down larger amounts of paint. And then 2 smaller ones. Again, you could get by with just one. If you're going to get just one, get one like this. This is a number 8. This is also from Hobby Lobby, Master's Touch round. And again, I like it because it holds a decent amount of water and paint, but it comes to a pretty nice point, especially when it gets wet. You can see it gets kind of small. And then this is a number 1. This is really small for tiny details. And in this exercise, we're not going to use this much, so you're okay not to have something like this. But and then on the paint colors, if you already have a set that has a variety of colors, I'm sure there's enough there that we'll be able to work with. If you don't have a set and you're going to do like I do and get a blank palette and fill it with tubed paints, then don't go with the most expensive if you're a beginner. There's several different brands, and you can ask questions privately if you want some tips on that. I'm not real loyal or particular to brands. Any of the major name brands work. But for the color palette, one of the colors I use a lot is French Ultramarine Blue. And this is a Winsor & Newton Professional, but you don't have to get that. And this was regularly priced $21.50, and I got it on sale for $13.50. This is a larger tube, so smaller tubes. But this gives you an idea of what the price is if you're buying the tubes, which is why, as a beginner, sometimes it's better to start with the pans. And then the other colors, I'll go from light to dark. So a yellow, and this is an Aurelian or Winsor yellow will work. And then an orange, and I'll explain later why orange instead of red and yellow mixed, but this is a Winsor orange, and it's my favorite from Winsor & Newton. And then this is a funny color, and I don't know why it's called this. I need to do research on it, but I kind of love this color. This is Scarlet Lake. This is also a Winsor & Newton, but it's sort of a red-orange, and especially with the koi, this just works really well. And then for the pure red, an alizarin crimson is a good darker, cooler red, and that's that one. So these are the primary colors, basically, blue, red, and yellow, with the orange and red-orange mixed in because it adds some interest. Then there'll be some neutrals. This is a yellow ochre, which I'm not sure if we're going to use these or not, so these are sort of optional, but yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and indigo. You either need indigo or black. You will need that. Those are your supplies. And oh, the other thing is a plain white plate, a flat plain white plate that you don't mind staining in case it stains, but just a porcelain. Usually it comes clean, but just in case, don't use like your best china. This is great for mixing. So have fun getting your supplies together, and the tutorial will start soon. Welcome to the first session in the tutorial, Watercolor Koi. The reference photo we're going to use is a photo my husband took. You can use this same image in the video to follow along. If you would like a high-res photo to use for your reference to do in the future, after the session is over, you can send me your email and I will send you a watermarked photo so that you can print it out and use it in your home. The first step in doing our watercolor painting, here's the image, just to let you know, doing a simple koi. The first step is to prepare your paper. I've started already with use your masking tape or drafting tape or painter's tape. And even if you have blue painter's tape, that would work. As I mentioned before in the materials list, when you tear off your strip of tape, first put it on your clothing to remove the sticky so that it doesn't ruin your paper. This is a 9x12 watercolor paper, 140 pound weight. Mine's Canson, but there are other brands that will work. Just make sure it's 140 pound weight. And then I have a clipboard. You can use a board. You can use a piece of cardboard if you're careful not to get it too wet, or if you have foam board will work as well. The tape doesn't stick as well to that, but I like this little coated clipboard, works well. Then tape down your edges. Make sure it overlaps. Try to keep it straight and even and overlapping. I can't see it, but I'm putting it on my apron. I like to wear an apron. I'm kind of obsessed with aprons anyway. And because this is a 9x12 paper and I want my image to be 8x10 so that it'll fit in a standard mat and won't require custom mat, I measured out on the long side. Of course, this is 12 inches this way, so I measured in 1 inch on each side to reduce it to 10 inches. Put my dots, and then in the other direction, I know this is actually simple math, but 9 inches across, but I want it to be 8 inches, so I went in 1/2 inch each, and then draw just some light lines so you know where to do your drawing. Now with a complex image, I do a grid method, which I've shared before, and I could, let's see, do we want to do the grid for this? This is a pretty simple image. I'm going to go ahead and do the grid though. So I'm going to divide this into quarters. So 5, 2.5, 7.5, 5, 2.5, 7.5. the reason I'm going ahead, this is a simple drawing. I mean, it's a simple image. If you're confident with your freehand drawing, then you could just look at the fish and rough it in. I'm just showing this because it's helpful. Okay, I started this yesterday and I wasn't paying close attention, so I made a mistake, but I'm gonna go with it, and because you might do something similar in the future. When I made my dots, I went in an inch on one side and some random amount on the other side. I just used the wrong guide. So I want my space in here to be 8 by 10. I got it correctly going lengthwise. It's 12 inches, went in an inch, so that's 10 inches. But then widthwise, I had this random 7 1/8, and I don't want my painting to be that random. I want it to be 8 inches so it fits well in a standard mat. So I had to make some adjustments. So the dots going widthwise is, it's 9 inches, so you go in 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch, and then make your image, make your lines. So now I'm going to erase my old lines with my gum eraser. Try to use an eraser as little as possible on your watercolor paper. It can damage the paper and affect your outcome. This was divided in quarters. Okay, and then in quarters this way, 8, 2, 6, 2, 6. Just light lines for your grid. You will erase them before painting. All right, now I'm going to turn off the camera and I'm going to do the same grid on this paper. Let me see, this is, so 8 inches. I'm going to use a white colored pencil or a piece of chalk. Actually, no, I have chalkboard. I have a chalkboard marker that works well for this. So then what we'll do is draw a square at a time. I'm going to start. I like to start in the, I'm right-handed, so I like to start in the upper left square, and I'm just going to focus on what I see in this first square. I'm just going to draw this, and I can see it in relationship to those lines, and then this, and all the way through till we're finished. And you don't need to draw in every single detail. Do as much or as little as you want, honestly. It's your playtime, so if it stresses you out to draw too much, then just do the basic shape. If you like having that much information, then do that. I tend to put in more information even if I'm going to try to loosen up later. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. You can fast forward through this part if you don't want to watch. going to erase as little as possible. You can see I had to make some adjustments as I went. In fact, even as I'm looking now, I see this is really, I'm gonna make some corrections here. It's more like that. And you can do it in a sketchy. It's better to do it kind of sketchy and loose than don't push real hard with your pencil. Okay, so this fin needed some correcting. And then that. So this is sort of contour drawing. You want to get the basic overall shape first before you start working on any of the details. So now that I've got the basic shape, you can see, now I'll go back in and get some of the details. I'll go ahead and erase the lines inside the fish, the grid lines. I'll be erasing the grid lines on the outside also, but for now I'm going to keep them. Just going to lighten them up a little. The reason I'm doing this now is because if I get some details in here that are too close to the line, then it's going to be hard to erase them without also erasing my sketch. So I'm just going to, I'm trying to define the details of the fish a little and the outline of the different colors. But I'm not going to outline the shadows. I'm paying attention to them, but I'm not going to outline them. You'll see why later. So now I'm just looking at things in relationship to what's already there to get the proper placement. Is that fin along the back ridge? I'm not really sure what it's called. And I'm not going to draw every little spot of color, just the main ones. I did, after I just said that about not outlining a shadow, I am outlining this shadow in the tail. Some of the ridges and the side fins would be helpful. Sometimes when you are working on a flat surface like this, and you're holding up this vertically and you're looking at this flat horizontally, you can get some distortion. The grid again helps with that, but it's good every now and then to hold them both up and compare. I think it's close enough. Notice where the color comes in relationship on the body to the fins and eyes. And again, these koi the color, please don't fuss over and erase the lines that you did for where the color is, because there's a lot of variation in nature. And if you draw it different than it is on this fish, the truth is it could have been like that. So don't erase that once you've done it. If the eyes or fins are in the wrong place or the wrong shape, that's more important, that you get the shape of the fish and in relationship to the eyes and fin and that mouth, stuff like that. If you need to make some corrections there, do so carefully, but don't fuss with the spots. Notice that the eyes, you might hold your pencil up, you know, they're in line with each other. And although we think of these eyes as round, from this perspective, they're actually oval. So be sure and draw them more like an oval. There's the eye, and then there's the edge of the socket, or lid, or I don't know what you call it. I drew a little bit exaggerated, because once you start painting it, kind of those small spaces are hard to maintain. Okay, got my drawing complete. That's the first step. Okay, we're going to start painting. The fun part starts today. If you haven't done this part of it, you can do it now, pause the video, or come back to it later, and you can draw the fish freehand or use the grid. If you use the grid, be sure you erase the grid lines and maybe darken the outer line of the fish so that when we get ready to do the background, that part is easy to see. And then we're going to start by doing the shadows of the fish. Sometimes I start with the background, sometimes I start with the form of the fish, but for today's exercise I'm going to start with the fish. And what we're going to be doing is trying to give that three-dimensional appearance to the fish before we do the detailed of the color. And so if you have trouble seeing the subtle difference between where the shadow begins and ends, you can squint your eyes and look at it, and that will help you see. For future reference, when you're doing your own image, you can also print out a black and white, and that will show you where the shadows are a little better. So that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to mix up a neutral gray, and then we're going to paint in those shadows. And I'll explain as I go why we're doing it that way instead of starting with the orange and red and black spots. All right, so now get your palette, and we're going to start with two colors. That is the burnt sienna. If you don't have burnt sienna, burnt umber might work. Some sort of brown that's in your palette, and ultramarine blue. And if you don't have ultramarine blue, you have some other blue, as long as it's one of the darker colors and not something with a lot of green in it. So ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And what you want to do is start by mixing up a good puddle of that color. So I've got my burnt sienna here, so I'll just, and I used my misting bottle to activate the paint. I just sprayed it all over so that it would be awake and ready to use. So I'm using my larger, or my medium size brush. This is a 10, and it's not the one with the tip that's real pointy. This one just gets a lot more paint. So I'm gonna soak up quite a bit of ultramarine blue and then add it to my pan here. I like to put it off to one side. And then just then activate the burnt sienna. Get a nice amount of that going. And then pull it in to this middle area right here. And you can see when you first bring it in, it looks kind of brown. And depending on, I should have got a little scrap paper. I'll get one in a minute, but actually I need to get a piece of paper for testing. But anyway, you mix it up and then you just decide if you want it to be more warm, more brown, or more blue. For here, I want it to be more blue, so I'm just going to go ahead and move over to this other side of the puddle. And you can see this makes a really nice gray. With a lot of pigment and less water, it looks almost black. But going for a more gray. In fact, I think I'm going to add more blue to it. I like to rinse my brush in between to keep my paint pans really clean. So I'm just going to add more blue in there and then dab in some more water because I want it to be fairly light. Okay, now that you've got your color mixed, we'll start painting, but I'm going to stop the video and start over so these are shorter, easier to upload. Now that you've already mixed your neutral gray, you can, we'll go ahead and do the painting for the shadows. You can see that in the amount of time it took me to do some other things that the colors separate a little. That's okay. I mean, one of the properties that's really lovely about the ultramarine blue is it does tend to separate, and sometimes it creates a neat effect. Even just the way it absorbs into the paper creates texture. It's very interesting. We probably won't notice it in the small amount we're going to use today, but don't worry about if that happens. When we get ready to paint, we'll just mix it up again. So I'll set that aside. And now the brush that we'll start with is the smaller, fairly pointed round. I'm using a number 8. So I'm going to be carefully looking at our reference photo and squinting my eyes to see where, and I'll start with the darkest darks in the shadow area. I might start up with the tail. Yeah, so I don't put my hand in the, get my brush wet, bring it to a nice point. Mix up the paint again. And it's better with watercolor to start lighter than you think you will need. And then you can always layer over and make it darker, but it's very difficult to go lighter once you've put dark paint down. So start lighter than you think, the shadows. And we're gonna use well, this first section I'm gonna do wet and dry, so the paper's dry. My brush is wet with paint. And I'm just gonna start laying that in. Using the tip of the brush, and it's better to start in the small area and pull toward the larger area. When I want to make a really nice, crisp line, turn it around. Sometimes it's good to work upside down. Yeah, you can see a lot better. This is going to be good. So I've got that darkest area in. Now I'm going to rinse my brush, but leave it fairly kind of a medium amount of moisture. And then I'm going to pull this edge. That's a little too much water. Dab it off. I want to have a hard edge and a soft edge. So I'm pulling it away from that. needs a little more blue. Now I dried my brush and I'm going to dab up some of this. I'm trying to create soft edges here. Two ways to do that. One is to lift up some of the water so that it doesn't puddle and make a hard edge, and another way is to add water and blend it out. So I've demonstrated both of those for the tail. Now I'll just work my way down. This top fin is going to need some details added later, but for now, I'm going to go ahead and darken that area. It's all kind of lifting up some of the paint with a dry brush. Now, I'm going to start with the outer edge of the fish and make a fairly hard edge there. And rinse my brush and pull with just a tiny amount of water on the brush. Now this really has very little paint, mostly that's wet with basically just water. I'm going to go, this is now sort of a wet and wet in some spots. You have to work kind of fast because it dries quickly. So I'm using my damp, clean brush just to, again, make a softer edge there. Toward the front here, it's a little darker. That's already wet from where I did it before. In fact, I'm going to show you the wet and wet technique. So I'm using just water on my brush, and I'm following where I want that shadow to be. Try to leave the white around the eye. That's the whitest white on the fish. So try not to get any water or paint on that. We're going to leave it white to the very end. So careful as you go around the eye with just water up to the mouth there. Now I'm going to this is just water, but I'm going to smooth out, draw out that outer edge with an empty dry brush. I don't know if you can see that, but that's just, it's primarily water. It's kind of dirty water, so it has a little color in it. But while it's still wet, now I'm going to drop in, load my brush with a little bit of that neutral gray, start in the area that's darkest, closest to the edge, and drop that in. It's one of my favorite things. Watching how the paint bleeds and flows. Again, being very careful to leave the white around the eye, leave that untouched. Okay, I want to blend this in with what I've done before, so I'm just going to carry it down. Rinse my brush out, and then I'm going to pull this way a little. I like the way that's bleeding and blending, so I'm just going to let it do its thing. If I start to see a hard edge where I don't want a hard edge, I will soften it before it dries. Right now I'm going to go ahead and add a little more. Notice that this actually in this spot goes up kind of close and is a dark spot. It dries lighter, so don't let it scare you if it looks too dark, as long as it's okay. That's the first step. We're going to go ahead and finish the shadow. While that's drying, and be careful not to touch anything that's wet, and don't work next to a wet area. So this is all still really wet, so I'm not going to work on that yet. You can tell by touching it. This is already dry. It dries very fast. So now I'm going to put the shadow in the fin. And this looks a little more brown to me. Doesn't really matter, but I'm going to start again. This is wet on dry. And if your brush has a lot of water along the edge, dry that off, because if those drops of water, when you turn your brush like this, the drops of water fall down and it can make a big splash on your painting. When you're trying to protect whites, that's especially not fun. So I'm using the side of the puddle that has a little more brown in it. And I'm gonna do the same method here. It looks really dark, but it's gonna be lighter when I'm just gonna lay that in a couple of the darkest spots, and then rinse my brush, dab it dry a little, but not too dry, not too wet. So much of this is just learning the feel of how the paint and the water interact together. Now I see more blue. You don't have to be this fussy. I'm a little bit overly fussy. Again, you'll learn what's comfortable for yourself in handling the brush. Okay, now I've got to soften these edges. None of this is very hard and detailed, so I'm using my clean brush that's slightly damp to just kind of fill in. And again, now I've lifted a lot of the color that was there, the dark value, in that area, which is fine. I can actually, while it's wet, just drop it back in. This is submerged fairly deep under the water, so it's very gray and not strong details. Just trying to give the illusion of shadow. All right, I'm going to try something. We'll see what happens. General rule of thumb is areas that are touching each other you don't want to work on if you want them to be separate. But this, I notice, kind of bleeds together, so I just got a little more blue mixed in with my neutral, and I'm gonna go ahead and pull that in. It's a little dark, rinsing it off. I'm using just plain water now to pull that in. On to this little fin on the back. start in the darkest area, rinse the brush, then pull with just plain water. Okay, on to the last big fin. I'm adding more blue to my neutral. I'm seeing blue. And again, I will start in this darker area. I'm not going to worry about the stripes at this point that are showing in the fin. I can add that later. Sometimes it's better not to. Then pull that color up. See, that ultramarine blue is doing its cool thing where it gets like little, I don't know how to explain it, but it gets kind of a cool effect. Okay, I'm gonna leave this lightest part of the fin as white as possible. Again, if I need to, I can always add more later, but it's reading, and I'm using a dry brush to just pick up and smooth out that edge. I don't want a hard line there. All right, one more little shadow. And actually, I'm going to use the smallest brush now. This you could wait till the end for this if you're nervous about it. But I'm going to go ahead and do the shadow on the mouth right here. Oh, I just realized. Okay, so this is the darkest shadow of the form, but there is a small shadow on the other side. It's very faint compared to this shadow. It's very faint, but in order to get that, again, the sense of 3-dimension, you got to have a little bit of that over on the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And again, it looks a little more blue, so I want my gray to be a little bit more of the blue. And turning this way, you can't, it's hard to see it up here, but I just know it's there. Okay, it's still not blue enough for me, so I'm going to add a little more blue. Reads really blue. Making a hard edge on the outside of the fish. Skip a few spots. I notice it's really not noticeable in some places. Now, clean brush. While this is still wet, this at the top might have dried a little, so up here I'm going over all of it again. Might actually lift a little, but kind of going over all of it just to soften that hard edge. Don't want a hard edge there. It's hard when you're first beginning because you tend to move slow, and you need to move slow to be careful. But some of these techniques, you can't let them dry too much before you go on to the next phase, or you will end up having kind of a mess. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and darken. This is fully dry, so I'm gonna go ahead and darken this area now. Dropping in the color, rinsing off the brush, using the clean brush to pull out those. And now I can see, it's funny how the more you look at it, that really there is this shadow over the whole tail. And that's a little too much paint. want to be sure and leave this outer edge as white as possible. I actually might have put the shadow too close. I'm going to use a napkin to dab up that edge because I want to leave it white. That's already dried, but I think it'll be okay. All right, that's all we're going to do for now. And I'm going to let this dry all the way before I start on my, I just realized something else up here. It needs to be kind of. All right, that's it for the shadow, the neutral gray shadow. And I'm going to let it dry before we do the next step.